So I want to continue up following that discussion that had been started yesterday on could it be that nothing is as real as God is? And nothing is as real as God is. And the argument here is that somehow there is a kind of reality to nothing. And what I want to do is turn a little bit to the proverbial horse in the mouth here. This is Jean-Paul Sartre's Being and Nothingness. And I'm looking at the chapter that's called The Immediate Structure of the For Itself. And it's the little section in there called The Facticity of the For Itself. And this is on page 81. It's the end there, and then I'm going to jump over to page 84, which is the last paragraph that ends that section. Here on page 81, Sartre says, but possibility can also appear to us as an ontological structure of the real. Then it belongs to certain beings as their possibility. It is the possibility which they are, which they have to be. In this case, being sustains its own possibilities in being. It is their foundation, and the necessity of being cannot then be derived from its possibilities. From its possibility. In a word, God, if he exists, is contingent. Again, this is Sartre throwing down this just fascinating account. He talks about his sort of being a waiter, talks about all these different things. And this is how he ends that discussion. And I think here we see Sartre clearly, by any outward, I think, religious standard, he's an atheist. Right? He's clearly an atheist. The account that he's giving is so mystical and so fascinating. I think many people know that a psychologist had given him, and he was experimenting with mescaline and was suffering, to some extent from various intense mescaline hallucinations during the time that he was writing Being and Nothingness. But at any rate, I think some of that maybe helps put into context the sort of magnitude of his, his orientation and ability to reflexively try to understand consciousness itself as a kind of nothing. Okay, so, and again, he's talking about here the difference between being in itself and being for itself. Being for itself is also called the pour soi, and being for itself is what human consciousness is. Okay, here's the last paragraph of that chapter. We must not confuse facticity with that Cartesian substance whose attribute is thought. To be sure, thinking substance exists only as it thinks, and since it is a created thing, it participates in the contingency of the ens creatum. But it preserves the character of being in itself in its integrity, although the for itself is its attribute. This is what is called Descartes' substantialist illusion. For us, on the other hand, the appearance of the for itself, or absolute event, refers indeed to the effort of an in itself to found itself. It corresponds to an attempt on the part of being to remove contingency from its being. But this attempt results in the nihilation of the in itself, because the in itself cannot found itself without introducing the self, or a reflective, nihilating reference into the absolute identity of its being, and consequently degenerating into for itself. The for itself corresponds then to an expanding destructuring of the in itself, and the in itself is nihilated and absorbed in its attempt to found itself. Facticity is then not a substance of which the for itself would be the attribute, and which would produce thought without exhausting it in that very production. It simply resides in the for itself as a memory of being, as its unjustifiable presence in the world. Being in itself can found its nothingness, but not its being. In its decompression, it annihilates itself in a for itself which becomes qua for itself its own foundation. but the contingency which the for itself has derived from the in itself remains out of reach. It is what remains of the in itself in the for itself as facticity, and what causes the for itself to have only a factual necessity. That is, it is the foundation of its consciousness of being or existence, but on no account can it found its presence. Thus, consciousness can in no case prevent itself from being, and yet it is totally responsible for its being. Ah, what a mind-blowing paragraph. I don't know how well, I mean, my guess is that people have to be reading along with that. So hopefully people were able to find that text and read along with that. Just absolutely amazing. I mean, I think what Sartre is trying to suggest is that being in itself can't found itself, because to found itself would be to, again, to introduce this kind of distance from itself. In the attempt to remove contingency, it it introduced the nothingness which created the distance by which the in itself can now haunt itself as another, as being for itself rather than just being in itself. The it's absolutely fascinating, this account that I think Sartre is trying to lay out, and it is very much aligned with so much of what Fred had to say about Spencer Brown's work and its relationship to these sort of absolute first principles. And it is very much aligned with a kind of Taoistic, or a focus upon emptiness, and the way that there are different kinds of nothing, and one of the most interesting kinds of nothing is that sort of primal room making nothingness that we call consciousness. You could look all day long and never find consciousness. It's a great Eastern saying that says, when I look for mind, all I can find are things of the world, and every time I try to find things of the world, all I can find is mind. Somehow, we're us, the world, everything is inside of mind, and yet we can't find the outside boundaries of the mind. Well, where is it? In some way, it's nothing. I mean, consciousness, which isn't uniquely human, right? I think the mistake would be to say that only humans have consciousness. No, the consciousness likely pervades all aspects of life, right? This is how life itself emerges out of inorganic being. The question becomes, how did human self-reflexive consciousness emerge? And here we this would take us well far afield, but for Sartre, there are three kinds of being, and this is partly why being in nothingness has been so misunderstood. People think of it as a kind of a dualism, which again, that's a great mistake. But Sartre is not even giving a bipart. It's actually a tripart. The three modes of being for Sartre are being in itself, being for itself, and being for others. And it's somehow the look, the le regarder. It's the way that others, through language, sort of, in, you could say, through the encounter with the other, which is its own kind of trial, we take on a whole new level of uh, a kind of being in our world, and it's all of it is made possible through a kind of grand and mysterious nothingness. Okay, thanks.